At the end of January, the Education Secretary, Charles Clarke, declared that education for its own sake is a bit dodgy. The idea, he went on, that you can learn about the world sitting in your study just reading books is not quite right. You need a relationship with the workplace. He also said he didn't care too much whether anyone studied the classics anymore, and even added it might not be such a bad thing if there were to be a decline in highbrow subjects at university altogether. So, nearly 150 years after Charles Dickens invented and pilloried Mr. Gradgrind with his facts, 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 hard times are back in English education. The Secretary of State himself has declared that learning for learning's sake is not justifiable. We're entering a new dark age. Only 0.2% of GCSEs taken in this country are in Latin, and only a tiny fraction of that in Greek. The study of classics has dwindled. Many people will not rue the fact that such elitist skills as using the aorist in Greek or conjugating Latin irregular verbs are virtually extinct. But so, therefore, is the ability to read the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Aeneid in their original languages, or to understand all the nuances of Plato and Aristotle, or the legal and political writings of the Roman Republic. I could go on. And if some people really think our country is better off as a result, or that the cause of civilization is thereby advanced, then God help them, and all of us. In 1869, Matthew Arnold, poet, critic, sometime school inspector, and son of Dr. Arnold of Rugby, published one of the greatest works of the 19th century, Culture and Anarchy, a critique of Britain's social and political life. Here he dealt definitively with the questions that still vex today's educationalists. Britain at the time had just witnessed the agitation that forced a Conservative government to pass the Second Reform Act, extending the franchise to the new middle classes, and the great thinkers of the day were concerned with one overriding question: how to get a largely uneducated population ready to play a larger role in an expanding democracy. Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, John Stuart Mill, and others all grappled with this, but only Arnold addressed the problem with clear vision. The whole scope of the essay, he wrote in the preface to Culture and Anarchy, is to recommend culture as the great help out of our present difficulties, culture being a pursuit of our total perfection by means of getting to know, on all the matters which most concern us, the best which has been thought and said. 135 years later, sunk in cynicism, we may well wonder at the very idea that our total perfection can ever be obtained. Sadly, few, if any, of the products of modern schooling will be able to translate the supremely hopeful superscription that Arnold placed at the start of his work, Estote ergo vos perfecti, loosely, therefore perfect yourselves. For Arnold, the essential quality a more civilized and humane people needed was education. Even if perfection were impossible, it might yet be approached through a greater understanding of all that had happened in the world, of other lands and civilizations and ways of thought. He railed against utilitarianism, rebuking the Manchester liberals who believed in it, for their failure to see how society had been diminished as a result. I shall deal with this in more detail next week. He also developed Ruskin's notion that before the electorate can properly use political power, it must be educated in the broadest sense. Both schools of thought, Arnold's and Ruskin's in the 1860s, Charles Clarke's today, could be said to be opposed to elitism. The difference is that the two Victorian sages wanted the fruits of elitism available to all, for the many, not the few, for the good of the nation, while modern thinking would have them disregarded altogether. Perhaps we think now that human nature cannot be perfected, so there's no point in trying. Arnold recognized that culture could be an engine of social and class distinction, though that is why he wished to spread it out as far as he possibly could. He called this propagation of education the extension of sweetness and light. Sweetness and light, to the modern ear, sounds almost twee, but he could not have chosen a better metaphor, and it is, beyond even his poetry itself, Arnold's most famous phrase. It conveys the mellifluousness and harmony of the highest aesthetics and the brightness and warmth of true civilization. What Winston Churchill, in a memorable speech in 1940, when he sought to describe the counterpoint to Hitler's chill darkness, called the broad sunlit uplands. To Arnold, sweetness and light, or learning for learning's sake, had a religious purpose. It was to make reason and the will of God prevail, or, as Montesquieu put it in more secular terms, to render an intelligent being yet more intelligent. Non-vocational education is about more than just ancient civilizations. It teaches more recent history, modern languages, and our own literature and language and art. It equips people to appreciate and to think. As Arnold put it, The purpose of culture was to enable people to question their stock notions and habits. He said that once this was appreciated, the moral, social and beneficent character of culture becomes manifest. For Arnold, the will of God was synonymous with the truth. I'm reminded of the Vulgate. Magna veritas est et prevalet. Great is the truth, and it shall prevail. And that could just as easily be a secular slogan. And so, at a stroke, Arnold's belief in the importance of sweetness and light becomes blindingly relevant to our times. He realized some would see the pursuit of sweetness and light, or learning for the sake of learning, as something to be disparaged. Utility is what many contemporary educationists, like Mr. Gradgrind of old, feel learning is all about. Do the politicians who have taken this line have an ulterior motive? If we are religious, we wish the will of God to prevail. If we're not, we still would like there to be the prevalence of the truth. How much easier either of those things are, and they may well be the same thing, when the populace has been well and broadly educated. But educated people are questioning people. Culture, by its very immensity and scope, diminishes ideologues and ideologies. As Arnold said, culture is always assigning to system makers and systems a smaller share in the bent of human destiny than their friends would like. Aha. Our times, unlike Arnold's, are those in which governments assume huge measures of social control, interfering in the lives of individuals. By denying them culture too, they make their intervention seem benevolent, rather than destructive of the human spirit. When we look at the last century and a third since Arnold wrote, we might wonder what success his call for sweetness and light actually had. He published Culture and Anarchy the year before Gladstone's Education Act, which introduced a measure of compulsory schooling for all children. The late Victorian and Edwardian periods saw an expansion of schools, formal education for girls and women, the development of institutes for working men, a determination to rescue Jude the Obscure from a life of unfulfillment and frustration. The Butler Education Act of 1944 extended opportunities even further. It brought the best university education within the reach of everyone intellectually equipped for it, irrespective of wealth. While there were elements of vocational teaching, the technical schools for example, education was generally viewed in the Arnoldian sense as something of breadth, meant to encourage the widest understanding of the world and its intellectual currents. As well as identifying the will of God with truth, Arnold identified it with reason. The pursuit of sweetness and light was about the pursuit of reason, and from that came order, or, as Arnold said, sweetness and light for as many as possible. He wanted a society in the fullest measure permeated by thought, sensible to beauty, intelligent and alive. That, of course, was high idealism, and Arnold again anticipated the dangers. He was canny enough to know that some would try to substitute ersatz sweetness. Plenty of people, he said, will try to give the masses, as they call them, an intellectual food prepared and adapted in the way they think proper for the actual condition of the masses. He went on to say, darkly, that the ordinary popular literature is an example of this way of working on the masses. He knew, too, there would also be attempts at indoctrination, when the popular mind was stimulated sufficiently to be receptive to ideas, but not given such sweetness and light to be sufficiently critical or discriminating about them. He saw political parties and religious organizations already doing both of these things. Had he been able to see ahead to prime-time television or the mass circulation press, Arnold would have seen two even more potent corruptors of his ideal. True culture, he said, does not try to teach down to the level of inferior classes. It does not try to win them for this or that sect of its own, with ready-made judgments and watchwords. It seeks to do away with classes, to make the best that has been thought and known in the world current everywhere. Preempting socialists, and I mean socialists of all parties, he said that this proved the fundamental point, that the men of culture are the true apostles of equality. But other means have since been used to promote equality, and they have not always been compatible with sweetness and light. Attempts have been made to teach reason, whether by teaching the humanities in schools or enshrining the principles of civilization in law as regards how we treat other people. Sadly, they have failed. The skill of literacy has been put directly to the use that Arnold feared, rather than to the use for which he hoped. Airport novels and tabloid newspapers may gratify and amuse, but do they enlighten? Sensationalism is more exciting than steady appreciation. Human nature has shown, and continues to show, a reluctance to be perfected. Everyone now receives an education, but too many see it in utilitarian terms, as a means to an end, a well-paid job, a house, a car. Thomas Carlyle once said that the only human right worth having is the right of the foolish to be governed by the wise. As a visceral Tory of what Ruskin called the old school, Carlyle was a pessimist. For him, society simply wasn't perfectible. The only hope was for strong governors to contain the promiscuous excesses of the people as best they could, by threats and sanctions. Education was positively dangerous to those who didn't know how to use it. It took a special man from the lower orders, like Carlyle himself, to treat learning as a lifelong process, and to be capable of serious self-improvement. Similarly, many modern education ministers have thought themselves wise, and believe they knew what is best for those they privately consider foolish. Perhaps there was an age, from the late Victorian period to the arrival of Tony Crosland at the Ministry of Education in the mid-1960s, when the English might have had a chance to perfect themselves. With the rise of the new middle classes, education became more important than ever. People made sacrifices of time and money in order to enrich their minds, and the state offered more and more support. It was not for everyone. The proportion of the population attending a university or a polytechnic remained small. But a broad education on the Arnoldian model was available, and it was prized. Crosland started to destroy the grammar schools. The policy continued under the Heath government, where Mrs. Thatcher was Education Secretary. Labour, back in office, wanted to destroy the private schools, even though with the elimination of class privileges would come the erasure of much high-quality education. Then, during 18 years of the last Conservative government, education ceased to be an end in itself. The politicians of that era didn't quite despise the notion of learning for learning's sake, but they saw university as little more than a step on a ladder, and wished to pump as many people as possible into tertiary education for political reasons. Hence the creation of many new universities and many new courses that at times seemed to be more residential apprenticeships than mind-expanding interludes between school and work. The old notion of teaching people to think seems mostly to have been lost. Thus, long before Charles Clarke, universities were becoming more and more places of vocational instruction. Courses were tailored to the life the undergraduates would lead on leaving university. Fewer and fewer people had an education that taught them, above all, to recognize great truths and to see that they prevailed. Those who shape our country's education policy have no proper conception of the true purpose of education. This is not all the fault of the politicians. There is an institutionalized resistance, still, among many people, to the very thought of being cultured. Once they have got their basic education and have acquired the skills that allow them to survive in the world of leisure or work, they have no further intellectual interests. They are without curiosity, and, what's more, the system in which they are brought up encourages them to remain militantly so. It is not just that they don't know about art and literature and history, it is that they expressly don't want to know. To Arnold, curiosity wasn't enough. To us, it would be a start. For sure, we have vastly improved the material welfare of our people since 1869, but has their moral, intellectual and spiritual welfare improved one iota? If not, this is the fault of politicians of all parties in the last 40 years, who have confused elitism with exclusivity, and have made the mistake of refusing to believe that equality could be achieved by levelling upwards. As a result, our age is darker than it need be. Our people have been made vulnerable to cynical manipulation, and, as I shall argue next week, they have been duped into thinking that the superficial extension of liberties is a substitute for the real power that comes with knowledge and understanding. Good night. When Matthew Arnold talked of the importance of culture as a civilizing force in his book Culture and Anarchy, published in 1869, he specified the importance of culture as a developer of intelligence. Culture was about the pursuit of perfection, and perfection required intelligence. A lack of intelligence then held similar dangers to a lack of intelligence now, notably a tendency to see the world in the wrong perspective, to place false values on things, and to come to misjudgments about oneself and others. So, when we have such a tendency in education as I described last week, when education for its own sake, as opposed to for a vocational purpose, is regarded as wasteful and extravagant, we are clearly running a higher risk of encountering all these difficulties. Arnold feared that without education people would be subject to random and ill-regulated action. Through lack of information, untrained thinking, or limited experience, they might perceive a state of affairs as being ideal and beneficial when, in fact, it was rotten and harmful. In the 1860s, less than a decade after the publication of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, there was a particular danger, the danger of people thinking that they could live as they liked within the law, and that they and society at large would be none the worse for it. Arnold, in his chapter sardonically entitled Doing as One Likes, takes issue with the great Manchester liberal John Bright on this very subject. He pillories Bright's proclamation that the central idea of English life and politics is the assertion of personal liberty. Arnold wrote only a year or two after Walter Bagehot had institutionalized the cult of the English Constitution in his book of the same name, and Arnold lamented the now cliched praise of that Constitution as a system which stops and paralyzes any power in interfering with the free action of individuals. Unlike Mill, Arnold felt that the untrammeled free action of individuals, even within the law, could do extraordinary harm. Even lawful acts could have awful consequences, and if people aren't taught to see that, those consequences could be devastating to society. It was beyond doubt to him that there would need at times to be a restraint on the actions of individuals. If the state had to impose a social order that would prevent anarchy, it was better it did it with the wholehearted consent of the people. Such consent, he knew, would be supplied only if the people's idea of perfection, and that of those who ruled them, happened to coincide. Both parties, the governors and the governed, would need greater and matching intelligence. In Arnold's time, the growing middle class was especially jealous of its prerogative of doing as it liked. Many were religious dissenters and didn't want the state to poke its nose into the chapel. Many were entrepreneurs and were against any greater regulation that might reduce their profits. Although Arnold had no great love for the middle classes, he recognized that their new wealth at least gave them a stake in the country, and an incentive to preserve the order that allowed capitalism to flourish. His real worry was about what he called the raw and uncultivated working class. There he saw the real tendency towards anarchy, for they'd been given almost all the same basic liberties as other Englishmen. Arnold thought they lacked the restraint and judgment about how to use them that could only come with education. With horror, he noted how the working man was beginning to assert and put in practice an Englishman's right to do what he likes, to march where he likes, meet where he likes, enter where he likes, hoot as he likes, threaten as he likes, and smash as he likes. Arnold ridiculed the assertions of his liberal friends, who said this kind of behaviour would soon blow itself out. He feared a situation akin to the French Revolution of 1789. In that sense, his fears were misplaced. A surprising proportion of the social order he observed is still intact today, with a queen on the throne, a prime minister in Downing Street, and a number of men still sitting in the House of Lords by merit of their birth. But Arnold was right to see liberty in a more conditional sense than the liberals of Mill's generation saw it. All the abuses of liberty he listed were abuses because the assertion of liberty by one individual could infringe the liberty of another. Someone's liberty to go about his or her daily business in peace and safety could be infringed by someone else's freedom to march, meet, enter, hoot, threaten, or smash. Clearly, there had to be limits on the actions of individuals to prevent them from damaging the lives of others. That could only come through education and the civilizing process. Perhaps, given the relatively tranquil nature of the last 135 years in this country, our people have been civilized as Arnold hoped. Or maybe doing as one likes now means something that Arnold never imagined. Maybe doing as one likes is not just tolerated by modern governments, but encouraged by them to keep the people happy. Arnold did not imagine either the welfare state or the permissive society. His fear was of violence, riot, and civil disorder. What has happened instead is a peaceful but far from passive assault on the wealth and property of the affluent. Charity, in the sense of looking after the poor, has been taken out of private hands and placed in those of the state. Its basic Christian motivation and its Christian effect on the giver and the receiver have been lost. I believe this has led to a claimant mentality growing up, claiming not the right to participate in the political process or to organize labour, but the right to live off the efforts of others, whether the others like it or not. The late Lord Jenkins of Hill Head was from 1965 to 67 a model of a reforming Home Secretary. He was in direct line of intellectual succession from John Stuart Mill. Much of the legislation passed or introduced during his time at the Home Office, legalizing abortion, making divorce easier, legalizing homosexuality, abolishing capital punishment, was geared to make people happy or to enhance their rights. He established himself not so much as an apostle of Mill, but of Denry Machin, Arnold Bennett's magnificent fictional creation, the eponymous Card, whose mission in life was the great cause of cheering us all up. Yet this vicarious pursuit not of perfection, but of self-indulgence, has damaged the rights of other significant groups, many of them among the most vulnerable in our society: unborn children, born children, deserted women, young people unsure of their sexuality, and the potential victims of murderous people of both sexes. Religion might once have been the opium of the people, but from the 1960s onwards it was replaced by the drug of permissiveness. Doing as one likes has a very different meaning now than it did in 1869. It's not mainly about political protest, for when we do that now, it is usually well behaved, and everyone has his or her rights. Now it's about abdicating social responsibilities and leaving the state to pick up the pieces. But state itself is a misnomer, for as Arnold knew, the state is simply the sum of the individuals who comprise it. It's not an abstraction called the state that pays for welfare dependency. It is the taxpayer who is compelled by law to fund it. Strong social pressure to conform has been swept aside by the emancipatory spirit of the permissive society. This is a clear example of how one set of individuals doing as they like imposes a cost on others. Arnold felt that when it came to doing as one liked, all the main classes would do differently, and inevitably clash. If so, there would be no place for poor old culture, as it set about its business of simply trying to see things as they are in order to seize on the best and make it prevail. He knew that England was in an epoch of expansion. The one salvation of such an epoch, he argued, was harmony of ideas. He hoped culture would be the unifier, appreciated as it might eventually be by all classes as representing the best and the pursuit of perfection. The trouble is, of course, that the Arnoldian way of making reason and the will of God prevail, which he held to be the whole point of culture, is seen in different ways by different groups in society. Benefit claimants, no doubt, think reason and the will of God have prevailed when they collect their cash. Top-rate taxpayers may not. The clash of cultures, which in Arnold's day was best phrased in religious terms as being between the orthodox and the dissenting, is now political and ideological. Every political group now claims to believe in liberty, the right to do as one likes, but everyone, inevitably, defines it in his own way. Arnold countered that argument by saying that certain elements of doing as one likes resulted so obviously in strife that they could not and should not be tolerated. He cited as an example a dissenting minister from Walsall, who went around stirring up anti-Catholic feelings with an excess of zeal, doing as he liked, undoubtedly, but also creating tensions and conflict that he had no clue how to put right. I think we should consider whether this has been the problem with those who have sought to extend the boundaries of freedom by developing a welfare state. They not only had no clue about the corrosive abuses they would be enabling, but would have no idea of how to put them right either. Arnold castigated the Victorian middle classes for their refusal to confront agitators, a refusal to deal with social anarchy for the good of the whole of that society. He saw the middle classes pretend to authority, but then refuse to exert it. Are there clear parallels today? Despairing of finding any authority in the middle class, admitting to the stupidity of the aristocracy and the untrained excesses of the workers, Arnold groped for a solution. What if we tried to rise above the idea of class to the idea of the whole community, the state, and to find our centre of light and authority there? That, though, would not work. It would mean simply surrendering to a ruling elite, drawn from whatever class happened to become elected, and having them impose their perhaps uncultured and uncouth wills on the rest of us. We are, he wrote, only safe from one another's tyranny when no one has any power, and this safety, in its turn, cannot save us from anarchy, and when anarchy presents itself as a danger to us, we know not where to turn. But if a society could be united by culture, by the pursuit of perfection, then that would spare us from the fear of being ruled by one group or another, for all would have the same experience of light, and all would have the same values. That, though, was an ideal too far, and what has happened instead in the last 135 years has been the rule at different times of all three classes, Liberal and Tory aristocrats, Labour working men, and the middle classes of all three parties. We have been ruled by the personal vision of the rulers, and their mandate for imposing that vision on us has only ever been from a minority of those consulted. Disraeli, Gladstone, Salisbury, Asquith, Attlee, Mrs. Thatcher, and Mr. Blair have all ruled Britain in a sectarian fashion, whatever their claims to have achieved national unity, and never created a society unified by a common exposure to sweetness and light. Each leader sought in different ways to placate those who, by their unrest or threat of unrest, have the potential for anarchy. The quiet life has replaced the unified life. People are allowed to do as they like, which is why, for most of the 20th century, organised labour was allowed sporadically to hold democratically elected governments to ransom, and why now industrious men and women of all classes work and pay high taxes, so that those, also of all classes, who make a lifestyle choice to live at the state's expense can do so without stigma. Arnold knew society was changing, and not merely because of the Reform Acts that extended political power down through society. He quoted with approval a maxim of the Duke of Wellington a generation earlier, that Britain was on her way to a revolution by due course of law. He knew the survival of the country as a serious power depended upon these changes, for Britain could not exist in a vacuum outside the rest of the industrially and socially developing world. He knew equally that such changes had to be managed in a framework of order if anarchy were to be prevented. He hoped reason, sweetness and light would be implicit in that orderliness. What in fact happened was that order was maintained by concession, as it always had to be, and by appeasement. 2 world wars didn't help. After the horror of the trenches, homes fit for heroes was the least a government could do, but it failed, for various reasons, to do it. The welfare state was the delayed reward, or bribe, paid after the second conflagration. In its half-century or so, it has been successively a tool to alleviate unavoidable poverty, then a means of keeping under some sort of control what Arnold's generation called the submerged tenth. The word has gone out, do as you like, and someone else will pay for it. Thus are, for instance, drug abusers allowed to go about their business, because they harm no one but themselves, don't they? Politicians have often said, trust the people, with varying degrees of hypocrisy. In allowing not merely liberty but license, we see the people are indeed being trusted. The costs of this trust are enormous, both in financial and social terms. The productive sectors of our economy pay for the unproductive ones, whereas that money could be better used for investment, innovation, and the expansion of prosperity. More to the point, this is possible only because of the connivance in the process by institutions. It is they, more than individuals, who have furthered the cult of what the Americans christened political correctness, designed to prevent anyone from speaking out about the consequences of doing as one likes. At the risk of perpetrating a breach of this new etiquette, I shall be examining the activities of our liberal practitioners next week. Is it not a paradox of our liberal society that freedom of speech is limited as never before in modern times? It's not just the extreme politeness otherwise known as political correctness, where nothing critical of a minority can ever, it seems, be mentioned. It's that we now have laws preventing people from saying unpleasant and ignorant things about, for example, ethnic minorities. An earlier generation would have felt it sufficient that such persons, by their own low behaviour, placed themselves outside the society of all decent people. But now it is felt they must be condemned by the law. There was even a suggestion a few years ago, supported by Jack Straw, that it should be a crime to deny the murder by the Nazis of 6 million Jews. Now, since only a mental defective or a malicious bigot could not accept that this genocide took place, it might be thought that the very act of denying it would bring punishment enough in derision and contempt upon those who did so. However, the penalty meted out to those warped minds who argue that the newsreels of Belsen were manufactured in a studio in Hollywood would not be for the benefit of the penalized. Rather, it would be for the benefit of those who proposed and then passed the law. Our liberals like nothing more than to grandstand, to search for wrongs and stupidities that can be magnified into absolute evils, and to punish them with illiberal severity. Happily, good sense has prevailed, and Holocaust denial has not been made a crime, and those who do it are denied their martyrdom. When in his book Culture and Anarchy Matthew Arnold lambasted the people he called our liberal practitioners, he attacked a very different sort of person, but one who was definitely the antecedent of those who practice what they call liberalism today. In a book that concerned itself much with theological dispute, and that accepted religion as a cornerstone of our society, Arnold identified the worst excesses of liberalism with decadence in religious practice and observation. He also thought that the obsession with free trade of 19th-century liberals made economics a higher consideration for them than humanity. On the religious question, he was perhaps a little wide of the mark even then. Carlyle, more than 20 years before, had noticed the secularization of the English mind, seeing the press as a new form of religion with an ever-growing number of devotees among the newly literate. Today, it's not the Bible that we live by, or any of the teachings of the mass media, but the tenets of what we have come to call political correctness, the most noxious creation of liberals and the most illiberal too. Some regard political correctness as a form of good manners. Others see it as a means of avoiding debate on problematical subjects, such as the contemporary issues of asylum seekers, or the activities of a few Islamic extremists in our otherwise peaceable Muslim community. In Arnold's day, the Liberal Party made up half the House of Commons, and many of its members were religious nonconformists. His particular gripe with them in 1869 was that as the Gladstone administration sought to disestablish the Church of Ireland, it was not motivated by reason and justice. It was, he said, motivated by the power of the nonconformists' antipathy to church establishments. In other words, they were motivated by prejudice. The very existence of an establishment was, ipso facto, a bad thing, just as it is a bad thing to their descendants today for anyone to criticize something the modern liberals of all parties hold sacred. Then they sought to impose their views about the superiority of nonconformism upon everyone else. Today, they seek to impose their views about the so-called multicultural society, or about what the Victorians called the undeserving poor, or about what some people still consider to be objectionable sexual and social practices, on everyone likewise. Any disagreement invites not debate, but ostracism for the dissentient. Arnold contrasted reason and justice, the attributes of any argument evinced by those who had benefited from sweetness and light, with the fetish or mechanical maxim. We can use the same comparison today between those liberals whose central hypocrisy is that they wish to confine freedom of expression, and those Tories who, oddly enough, wish to let it flourish. I am not, of course, saying that the Tory mind is one inevitably marked by reason and justice. I'm not that naive. But at least it does not demonstrate the inconsistency of demanding a free-for-all for everyone, just so long as they agree with the prevailing orthodoxy. We live in a society where all sorts of people, lawyers, local government officials, even tiresome newspaper columnists, make a living in an industry concerned with getting people their rights. The whole notion of political correctness is wedded to this. The fetish, as Arnold would have called it, exists to invent rights for people in principle, then, if possible, have them passed into law. If a new right is proclaimed with sufficient force, the rest of us are supposed to concede that it must become a matter of statute. To take one example, the government has now been persuaded that it should not be illegal for homosexual men to have intercourse with each other in public lavatories. Their rights, apparently, would be infringed otherwise. Similarly, it has become, it seems, a right for people with no claim on this country, who have never paid taxes here and who give no allegiance to its sovereign, to become beneficiaries of our welfare state. Those who criticize the former are condemned as homophobes, the latter as racists. Such terms of abuse close down the debate that the liberals, of course, do not want. Their main interest is to alter society and to destroy its previous values. Debate, and the exposition of reason it would bring, would not be helpful in that context. There are not, it seems, two sides to every story. Does anyone, asked Arnold, if he simply and naturally reads his consciousness, discover that he has any rights at all? He thought not. The deeper I go into my own consciousness, the more it seems to tell me that I have no rights at all, only duties. Arnold railed against the concept of the false ideal, and stated yet again how reasonableness and education would help prevent such mistakes. Sadly, we now live in a world of false ideals, made for us by liberals of the sort to which he so violently objected. For Arnold's generation, the great liberal excess was the determination by the House of Commons to pass a bill to enable a man to marry his deceased wife's sister. In our age this might seem trivial or fruitling, and self-evidently acceptable. Then, though, it seemed no less shocking to many than the modern idea that homosexuals should be allowed to contract marriages with one another does to some people now. Arnold ridiculed the notion that just because the Bible did not expressly forbid something, it was acceptable for someone to do as he liked in that context. He said this idea was most eminently exemplified in that crowned Philistine, Henry VIII, the craving for forbidden fruit, and the craving for legality. This brings us back to our own liberal practitioners. They seek to use legality to sanction ideas or practices that many regard as wrong and contrary to the interests of society. And they seek also to use the law to punish those who might start to express contrary opinions. Even Arnold in his most pessimistic moments did not conceive of that second development. The freedom to be ignorant and the freedom to be offensive might not have been admirable, but they were inevitable, and they were worth controlling by law only when they became positively dangerous. Today, even if thought is still not a crime, the expression of certain thoughts is. And who's to say that some expressions of opinion that now merely invite social ostracism will not themselves in future be criminalized? Why else would the European Union, in its draft constitution, seek to reserve the right to ban political parties? I don't dispute that much of this has sprung from the best intentions. It's appalling, for example, that any Briton should be disadvantaged because of his or her ethnic origin. However, when liberals are thwarted, when ostracism is not enough, but the law cannot be railroaded into the sort of authoritarianism they like, true liberty is put at risk. We have seen this in the case of the murdered London student, Stephen Lawrence. Two facts are not in doubt. Mr. Lawrence was murdered, and the people who murdered him have not been, and will not be, punished for the crime. It is impossible to judge the motivations of others, though the law these days claims, with shocking presumption, to be able to do so. But it is highly likely that Mr. Lawrence was murdered by white racialists simply because he was black. There is video evidence, indeed, of the alleged murderers boasting about how they would like to kill black people. In any case, the motivation is in the end irrelevant. An innocent person is cruelly killed, and those who did it shall be brought to justice and punished with the mandatory sentence, a sentence whose severity is unaffected by the motivation for the crime. Some people nevertheless saw their opportunity, in the wake of this injustice, to use it for other ends. Some saw it as a means to attack the whole basis of our society, even though the shock and disgust of all right-thinking people at this murder was plain to see and hear. The particular focus was on the actions of the police. Many murders, of white people as well as black, are not investigated satisfactorily because of a lack of hard evidence or because of police incompetence. Because Mr. Lawrence's family had little social influence, the police may well have been casual in the extreme about investigating the case. Whether that was because of their race, or whether a humble white family would have suffered likewise, should be a matter for debate. Any objective observer of the Lawrence fiasco could see that incompetence played a huge part in it. However, the lawyer who conducted the inquiry, Sir William Macpherson, said it was down to something called institutional racism. Some of us had always thought that racial prejudice, like any other form of bigotry, had to be founded in the minds of individuals. Sir William chose to overlook that. The Metropolitan Police was scapegoated for this act of wickedness. A mind was invented for it that was deemed racist. Individual policemen were told they were inevitably racist, whether they had ever harboured such thoughts or not. Keen to join in the mood of national self-flagellation, other bodies decided they too were probably institutionally racist. Some immediately acquired policies aimed at preventing any further lurches in this direction, all of which was designed to waste a great deal of public money, but made those in charge feel a great deal better. Nor, of course, does the matter end with institutional racism. There's almost certainly institutional sexism. However, not all these institutional isms are bad. Institutional classism, when practiced against the more privileged classes, such as when their children apply to universities, appears entirely justified in the interests of progress. It's like the now discredited American idea of affirmative action, which many perfectly able black people came to resent because of the way in which it patronized them. And institutional leftism, where the orthodox politically correct view of the world is made to prevail and become the norm, is of course highly acceptable almost everywhere now. That it might not be related to normal life seems merely a quibble, and we are forced to ask again and again, which is the illusion and which the reality. Arnold implored that we must not let the worship of any fetish, any machinery which are not, like perfection, absolute goods in themselves, though we think them so, create for us such a multitude of miserable, sunken, and ignorant human beings, that to carry them all along with us is impossible. Yet the determination our liberal practitioners have to devote themselves to the promotion of sectional interests without debate, and to ostracize those who demur, is the worship of just such a fetish. It results in what Alexander Solzhenitsyn called the censorship of fashion. And all this happens, to return us to a theme that has run through all three of these talks, because of a want of reason. In deploring the fact that the lower classes of his day seemed unable to stop procreating, Arnold called their behaviour just as contrary to reason and the will of God as for a man to have horses or carriages or pictures when he cannot afford them. He castigated liberals for not seeing this. In my first talk, I argued that to deprive people of a proper education was to rob them of the power of reason. In my second, that the abuses of our welfare state and its depleting effect on society was a sign of that lack of reason. Today, I've tried to argue that the hijacking of our perceptions and the stifling of our freedom of expression is done by the unreasonable, and that their victims, lacking reason themselves, are powerless to counter it. And simply for saying these things, I can expect to be howled down by illiberal liberals. But we can either carry on down this road, where truth is inverted, and a majority will find itself enslaved to diverse minorities, or we can begin again to act in accordance with the tenets of culture, suitably dosed up by sweetness and light, in the pursuit of reason, as Matthew Arnold recommended. It is not too late, but it soon will be.